By 9:17 a.m. on Monday morning, 12 servers were down, the customer database was locked, and 3 departments couldn't access their files. The CEO was screaming into his phone while IT scrambled to figure out what had gone wrong. But Cassandra Mitchell knew exactly what had happened. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot, watching through the glass doors as chaos unfolded inside Dataflow Solutions, and for the first time in months, she was smiling. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 3 weeks earlier, Cassandra had been the kind of employee every company claims to want, but few actually appreciate. She'd been Dataflow Solutions Senior Systems Administrator for 4 years, the person who kept their entire digital infrastructure running smoothly. While everyone else went home at 5, she was the one who stayed late to run system updates, monitor security patches, and ensure their client data remained secure and accessible. Dataflow Solutions wasn't some Silicon Valley startup or Fortune 500 corporation. It was a mid-sized data management company in Columbus, Ohio, serving about 200 clients across the Midwest. They handled everything from small business customer databases to municipal record systems. The company employed 43 people, and Cassandra was one of only 2 people who had administrative access to their core systems. Her colleague, Marcus Thompson, was the other systems administrator, but he'd been hired just 8 months ago and was still learning the ropes. The truth was, if something went seriously wrong with their infrastructure, Cassandra was the only person who could fix it quickly. She'd built most of their current systems from scratch, documented every process, and created the security protocols that had kept them breach-free for 3 years running. The weekend work had started small. Initially, it was just occasional Saturday morning maintenance windows that couldn't be done during business hours. Cassandra didn't mind at first. She was single, lived alone with her 2 cats, and the overtime pay was decent. Plus, she genuinely cared about the company's success. She'd watched Dataflow grow from 28 employees to its current size, and she felt invested in its future. But over the past year, the weekend requests had escalated. What began as monthly Saturday maintenance became weekly weekend deployments, emergency patches and client implementations that somehow always seemed to require weekend work. The company had landed several large contracts, including the City of Toledo's records management system and a regional hospital network, both of which demanded round-the-clock availability. Cassandra found herself working nearly every Saturday and most Sundays. She'd arrive at the office around 8 in the morning and often wouldn't leave until well into the evening. The work was complex and demanding. She'd be coordinating with vendors, implementing security updates, migrating data for new clients, and troubleshooting issues that arose during implementations. The breaking point came on a particularly brutal weekend in early November. Dataflow had promised their largest client, Midwest Medical Associates, that their new patient portal would go live Monday morning. The implementation required migrating 15 years of patient records, integrating with 3 different hospital systems, and ensuring HIPAA compliance throughout the process. Cassandra spent 18 hours on Saturday and 14 hours on Sunday, making it happen. She barely took breaks to eat, surviving mostly on coffee and vending machine snacks. The migration was incredibly complex, requiring her to write custom scripts, coordinate with multiple database administrators at different hospitals, and test every component multiple times to ensure patient data remained secure and accessible. By Sunday evening, she was exhausted but proud. The portal was ready, all systems were running smoothly, and Midwest Medical's IT director had sent an email praising the seamless transition. Dataflow had just secured their biggest implementation success to date. When Monday arrived, Cassandra expected some recognition, maybe a thank you from management, or at minimum her substantial overtime payment for the 32 weekend hours she'd logged. Instead, she received an email from Brenda Harrison, the HR director, requesting a meeting. Brenda was one of those HR professionals who spoke in corporate buzzwords and seemed to view employees as potential liability risks rather than human beings. She joined Dataflow about 2 years ago, bringing with her a philosophy of optimizing human resources expenditure and maximizing operational efficiency. The meeting took place in the small conference room adjacent to Brenda's office. Cassandra arrived expecting to discuss her weekend overtime claim, which totaled over $1,200. Instead, Brenda slid a printed document across the table. "We need to discuss your recent overtime submissions," Brenda began, her voice taking on that particular tone HR people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "Management has reviewed your weekend work claims, and we have some concerns about the necessity and efficiency of these hours." Cassandra stared at the document. It was her timesheet from the previous weekend, but someone had annotated it with red ink, questioning nearly every hour she'd logged. Comments like, "Could this have been done more efficiently?" and "Was Saturday's presence really necessary?" covered the margins. "I don't understand," Cassandra said, trying to keep her voice level. The Midwest medical implementation was scheduled for this weekend specifically because it couldn't be done during business hours. We discussed this in the project meeting 3 weeks ago. Brenda consulted her notes. "While we appreciate your dedication, the company is implementing new policies regarding weekend compensation. Effective immediately, weekend work will only be compensated at regular hourly rates, not overtime rates, when the work could potentially be completed during normal business hours." "But this work couldn't be completed during business hours," Cassandra replied, feeling her frustration building. "We're dealing with live medical systems. Any disruption during weekdays could affect patient care. That's why we specifically scheduled it for the weekend. According to our analysis, with proper planning and efficiency improvements, most of this work could be accomplished during regular hours or delegated to junior staff members." Cassandra felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Junior staff members? Marcus has been here 8 months. He doesn't have the clearance or expertise to handle HIPAA-compliant medical data migrations, and he certainly doesn't know our systems well enough to troubleshoot issues on the fly. That's precisely why we're encouraging you to document your processes more thoroughly and provide better training to junior team members. This will reduce our dependence on weekend overtime and create a more sustainable operational model." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the ESA message was clear. Dataflow was refusing to pay her overtime for the weekend work, claiming it was inefficient and unnecessary. They were retroactively changing the terms of her employment, deciding that work she'd been doing for months at overtime rates would now only be compensated at regular pay. Worse, they were suggesting that her expertise wasn't really necessary, that her carefully orchestrated systems implementations could be handled by someone with a fraction of her experience. It was insulting on every level. As Cassandra walked back to her desk, she realized this wasn't just about money. Though losing $1,200 in expected overtime was certainly painful. This was about respect, recognition, and basic fairness. She'd given Dataflow her weekends, her evenings, and her expertise. She'd made them successful, kept their systems secure, and enabled their growth. And now they were telling her that her work wasn't worth what they'd originally agreed to pay for it. She sat at her workstation, staring at her multiple monitors, displaying system status dashboards, server logs, and security alerts. Every piece of technology humming around her was something she'd configured, optimized, or secured. She was the invisible foundation holding Dataflow's entire operation together. But apparently, they thought that foundation was expendable. Over. The next few days, Cassandra began to see things differently. She noticed how Michael Rodriguez, the CEO, would casually mention in meetings that the system runs itself when talking to potential clients. She observed how the sales team promised implementation timelines that were only possible because of her weekend work, then took credit for the company's reliability and quick turnaround times. She realized that while she'd been focused on doing excellent work and keeping the company running, Management had been taking her contributions for granted. They'd built their business model around her unpaid dedication, then decided even that wasn't enough. The final straw came the following Friday when Michael announced in the all-hands meeting that Dataflow had just signed their largest contract ever with Great Lakes Manufacturing, a deal worth over $2 million annually. He talked about the company's bright future, the possibility of bonuses for the sales team, and plans to hire additional staff. But there was no mention of the people who actually made that success possible. No acknowledgement of the technical team that kept everything running. No recognition of the weekend work that enabled their rapid client implementations. As Cassandra sat in that meeting, listening to Michael take credit for the company's technical capabilities, she made a decision. If Dataflow wanted to treat her as expendable, she would show them exactly how expendable she really was. But she wouldn't quit. That would be too easy for them, and it wouldn't teach them anything. Instead, she would give them exactly what they'd asked for, a more efficient operation that didn't rely on her weekend expertise. She would remove herself as a single point of failure in the most educational way possible. That Friday evening, Cassandra stayed late at the office, but not to work on urgent fixes or weekend preparations. Instead, she was conducting an audit of her own access and permissions across Dataflow's systems. What she discovered was both gratifying and terrifying. Her administrative credentials had access to virtually everything. The main database servers, the backup systems, the security firewalls, the client portals, the email servers, the file storage systems, and even the building's electronic access controls. Over her 4 years at Dataflow, she'd accumulated permissions that no single person should probably have, but which had evolved naturally as she'd become the go-to person for any technical crisis. More importantly, she realized that most of these permissions existed in a gray area of documentation. When she'd initially set up many of these systems, she'd created her administrative accounts with broad access to facilitate troubleshooting and maintenance. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. But as the company had grown and systems had been added, those permissions had never been properly reviewed or restricted. Marcus, despite being her colleague, actually had significantly fewer permissions. His access was limited to specific servers and applications, reflecting his newer status and still developing expertise. If something went wrong with the core infrastructure, he wouldn't be able to fix it without Cassandra's help or intervention. Over the weekend, Cassandra began developing what she privately called her education plan. She wouldn't sabotage anything or cause immediate harm to the company's operations. Instead, she would systematically remove herself from the equation in a way that would demonstrate her actual value to the organization. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. She would methodically revoke her own administrative permissions across all systems, effectively making herself unable to perform the emergency interventions and weekend work that Dataflow had come to depend on. When problems arose that required her level of access, she would no longer be able to help, regardless of how much the company needed her to. The beauty of this approach was that she wasn't technically doing anything malicious. She was simply reducing her own access to systems, which could be seen as a security best practice. If anyone questioned her actions, she could point to corporate security policies that recommended limiting administrator access to only what was absolutely necessary for day-to-day responsibilities. Her first target was the backup system. Dataflow's backups ran automatically every night, but they required periodic maintenance and monitoring. The system occasionally failed, usually due to network issues or storage problems, and when that happened, someone needed administrative access to restart the processes and ensure data integrity. Cassandra accessed the backup server's administrative panel and removed her account from the high-level administrator group. She left herself with basic read-only access, enough to view backup status, but not enough to restart failed processes or perform maintenance tasks. Next, she tackled the database servers. These were the heart of Dataflow's operations, containing all client data and running the applications that customers accessed through their web portals. Cassandra had set up automated monitoring and alerting for these systems, but when alerts triggered, someone needed administrative access to investigate and resolve issues. She systematically removed her elevated database administrator rights, leaving herself with only the standard application access that regular users had. She could still perform basic database queries for her daily work, but she could no longer restart services, modify system configurations, or troubleshoot performance issues. The email server was next. Dataflow's email system served not only internal communications but also automated reports and alerts that went to clients. When email problems occurred, they needed to be resolved quickly to maintain customer confidence and ensure business continuity. Cassandra removed her administrative access to the email server, along with her ability to manage user accounts, restart services, or modify server configurations. If email went down, Marcus would have to handle it, but his access was limited to basic user management tasks. She continued through the network infrastructure, the security firewalls, the client portal, servers, and the file storage systems. Each system required careful consideration of what level of access to maintain for her daily responsibilities versus what level was needed for emergency interventions. The most delicate part of the plan involved the security systems. Data flows, firewall, and intrusion detection systems required regular updates and monitoring. These systems protected not just the company's data, but also their clients' sensitive information. Cassandra had to be careful not to create actual security vulnerabilities while removing her access. She spent considerable time crafting her approach to the security systems. She removed her ability to modify firewall rules or update security configurations, but she left monitoring access intact. This meant she could still see if security issues arose, but she couldn't do anything about them without escalating to someone else. Throughout this process, Cassandra was meticulous about documentation. She created detailed logs of every permission change she made, along with justifications for each modification. She framed everything in terms of security best practices and risk reduction, building a paper trail that would protect her if anyone questioned her actions. The most challenging aspect was timing. She needed to remove her access gradually to avoid triggering immediate suspicion, but she also needed to complete the process before any major systems issues arose that would require her intervention. She decided to implement the changes over a 2-week period, focusing on different systems each day. This approach would make the permission changes look like routine security maintenance rather than a coordinated effort to limit her own capabilities. During this time, Cassandra maintained her normal work routine. She attended meetings, responded to emails, and handled routine technical issues that fell within her remaining access levels. To her colleagues, everything appeared normal, but she was also watching carefully for signs of system stress or potential problems. Dataflow's infrastructure was generally stable, but like any complex technical environment, it required regular attention and occasional intervention. Cassandra knew that it was only a matter of time before something would go wrong that required her previous level of access. The first test came on a Wednesday morning when the backup system failed. Normally, Cassandra would have received an automated alert and would have logged in to restart the backup processes within minutes. Instead, she received an alert that she could see but couldn't act upon. Marcus received the same alert, but when he tried to resolve the issue, he discovered that he didn't have sufficient access to restart the backup services. He came to Cassandra's desk, expecting her to handle it as usual. "The backup system is down," he said, showing her the alert on his phone. "Can you take a look?" Cassandra pulled up the backup monitoring dashboard on her computer. She could see the problem clearly. A network connectivity issue had interrupted the backup process, and the system needed to be restarted to resume operations. "I can see the issue," she told Marcus, "but I don't have administrative access to restart the backup services anymore. I removed those permissions last week as part of a security audit." Marcus looked confused. "But if you can't restart it and—" "I can't restart it. Who can?" "I guess we'll need to contact our vendor support," Cassandra replied calmly. "They should be able to walk someone through the process remotely, or they might need to send a technician on site." The vendor support call took 3 hours to resolve. During that time, Dataflow's backups remained offline, meaning that any data, changes, or new client information weren't being protected. It was a minor crisis that could have been resolved in 5 minutes with proper administrative access, but instead became a 3-hour ordeal involving external support. Michael Rodriguez, the CEO, was not pleased when he learned about the backup outage. He called a meeting with the IT team to understand why such a simple issue had taken so long to resolve. "This is exactly the kind of problem that should never happen," Michael said, pacing around the conference room. "We have 2 systems administrators on staff. Why did we need to call vendor support for a routine restart?" Marcus explained that neither he nor Cassandra had the necessary permissions to restart the backup services, and that Cassandra had recently removed her administrative access as part of a security review. Michael turned to Cassandra. "Why would you remove your own access to critical systems? That doesn't make sense." Cassandra had prepared for this question. "Based on our security policies and industry best practices, administrative access should be limited to only what's necessary for daily responsibilities. Since I don't routinely restart backup services, that level of access represents a security risk that should be eliminated. But what happens when we need someone to restart backup services? There are proper escalation procedures through our vendors, or we can request temporary elevated access through appropriate channels when specific situations arise." Michael was clearly frustrated, but Cassandra's explanation sounded reasonable from a security perspective. The company had been talking about improving their security posture, and limiting administrative access was indeed a standard recommendation. The meeting ended with a directive to review all administrative access and ensure that proper procedures were in place for emergency interventions. But no one suggested that Cassandra should restore her previous access levels. Over the following days, Cassandra continued her systematic removal of permissions. Each system she touched became slightly more difficult for her to manage, and slightly more dependent on external support or Marcus's limited capabilities. She also began to notice changes in how people interacted with her. Previously, colleagues would come to her desk throughout the day with urgent technical questions or requests for help. Now, many of those requests were being redirected to Marcus or were requiring longer resolution times through proper support channels. The irony wasn't lost on her. For months, she'd been working excessive hours to keep Dataflow's systems running smoothly, and management had decided that her expertise wasn't worth overtime compensation. Now, as she systematically reduced her ability to provide that expertise, the company was starting to experience the inefficiencies and delays that came with not having immediate access to senior technical knowledge. But the real test was still coming. Cassandra knew that her permission changes would only matter when a serious problem arose that required the kind of deep system access and expertise that she'd previously provided. And based on her experience with Dataflow's infrastructure, she knew that such a problem was inevitable. The only question was when it would happen and whether the company would understand the connection between their decision to devalue her, weekend work, and their suddenly reduced ability to handle technical crises. The second incident happened on a Friday afternoon, just as most employees were preparing to leave for the weekend. Great Lakes Manufacturing, Dataflow's newest and largest client, was experiencing intermittent connectivity issues with their data portal. Their operations manager, Janet Walsh, was calling every 30 minutes demanding updates and threatening to escalate to Dataflow's executive team. Great Lakes Manufacturing processed automotive parts orders through Dataflow's portal 24 hours a day, supporting 3 manufacturing shifts. Even brief outages could halt production lines and cost thousands of dollars per hour. This was exactly the kind of high-pressure situation that had previously required Cassandra's weekend intervention. Marcus received Janet's increasingly frantic calls while trying to diagnose the connectivity problems. The portal itself was running normally, but something in the network infrastructure was causing periodic timeouts and data transmission failures. It was the kind of intermittent issue that required deep system access to trace through multiple layers of network equipment and server configurations. "I need to check the firewall logs and network routing tables," Marcus told Cassandra as he stood at her desk, looking overwhelmed. "But the system keeps rejecting my login credentials." Cassandra pulled up the network monitoring dashboard, which showed clear signs of packet loss and routing anomalies between Dataflow's servers and Great Lakes' connection. The problem was definitely in their infrastructure, but diagnosing the exact cause would require administrative access to several network components. "I removed my network administrative permissions 2 weeks ago," she explained to Marcus. "Security compliance requires that access to network infrastructure be strictly limited and properly audited. But you're the only one who knows how our network is configured," Marcus said, the stress evident in his voice. "I've never had to troubleshoot routing issues before." "We'll need to follow proper escalation procedures," Cassandra replied. "I can submit a request for temporary elevated access, but that requires approval from both the IT director and security officer. The process usually takes 24 to 48 hours. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "Janet Walsh says, they're losing $15,000 every hour their portal is down. We can't wait 2 days for permission approvals." "Then we should contact our network vendor for emergency support," Cassandra suggested. "They have technicians who can remotely access our systems and perform the necessary diagnostics." The vendor support call turned into a nightmare. The first technician who answered didn't have experience with Dataflow's specific network configuration. After an hour of basic troubleshooting, he escalated to a senior engineer who wouldn't be available until Monday morning. Meanwhile, Janet Walsh escalated her complaints to Michael Rodriguez, who called an emergency meeting in the conference room. The entire executive team was present, along with Marcus and Cassandra. "We have our largest client threatening to terminate their contract because we can't keep their portal running," Michael announced, his face red with frustration. "This is exactly the kind of technical crisis that should never happen with our level of expertise." "The issue appears to be in our network infrastructure," Marcus explained nervously. "It's an intermittent routing problem that requires deep system access to diagnose properly." "Then why haven't you fixed it?" demanded Sandra Phillips, the sales director who had personally negotiated the Great Lakes contract. "Neither Marcus nor I currently have the administrative access needed to troubleshoot network infrastructure issues," Cassandra said calmly. "Those permissions were removed as part of our ongoing security compliance initiative." The room fell silent for a moment as the executives processed this information. "Are you telling me," Michael said slowly, "that we have a critical client emergency and our 2 systems administrators can't access our own network equipment?" "That's correct," Cassandra confirmed. "Administrative access to network infrastructure requires proper approval workflows and documented business justification. The security protocols we've implemented don't allow for immediate emergency access." Brenda Harrison, the HR director who had denied Cassandra's overtime pay, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "But surely there must be some procedure for emergency situations?" "There is," Cassandra replied. "We can request temporary elevated access through the formal approval process, which takes 1 to 2 business days. Alternatively, we can engage vendor support for emergency assistance, though that requires scheduling and may take several hours." Sandra Phillips exploded. "Several hours? Great Lakes is talking about pulling their $2 million contract. They're not going to wait several hours for us to figure out how to access our own systems." The meeting continued for another 45 minutes, with various executives demanding immediate solutions that didn't exist. Eventually, they agreed to pay premium rates for emergency weekend vendor support, hoping to resolve the issue before Great Lakes Monday morning operations meeting. The emergency technician didn't arrive until Saturday afternoon. He spent 3 hours diagnosing the network problem, which turned out to be a misconfigured routing table that had been gradually corrupting over several weeks. The fix itself took only 15 minutes once the problem was identified. The total cost for emergency weekend vendor support was $4,800. The issue could have been resolved by Cassandra in under an hour if she'd had the network administrative access she'd held for the previous 4 years. Great Lakes Manufacturing was furious about the extended downtime. Although Dataflow managed to restore their portal service before Monday morning, the incident damaged their relationship with their largest client. Janet Walsh sent a formal complaint to Michael Rodriguez, questioning Dataflow's technical capabilities and reliability. The following Monday, Michael called another emergency meeting, this time focused specifically on the IT department's access and procedures. I want to understand exactly what happened this weekend and how we prevent similar incidents in the future, Michael began. We lost credibility with our biggest client and spent nearly $5,000 on emergency support for a problem that should have been routine. Marcus looked exhausted after his weekend of coordinating with vendors and managing client communications. The network issue was complex, but not unusual. The problem was that neither Cassandra nor I had the access needed to diagnose and fix it quickly. "And why don't you have that access?" Michael asked, turning to Cassandra. Cassandra had spent the weekend preparing for this conversation. Over the past month, I've been implementing security best practices that require limiting administrative access to only what's essential for daily responsibilities. This approach reduces our security risk and ensures better audit compliance. But it also means we can't respond quickly to emergencies, Michael pointed out. That's correct, Cassandra agreed. There's always a trade-off between security and convenience. The security protocols we've implemented prioritize data protection over rapid response times. Whose decision was it to implement these security changes? Michael asked. The changes were based on industry best practices and compliance requirements, Cassandra replied carefully. After our recent discussions about operational efficiency and resource optimization, I thought it was appropriate to align our access controls with standard security frameworks. Brenda Harrison looked uncomfortable as she realized the connection between the security changes and her recent criticism of Cassandra's overtime work. But she couldn't openly object to security improvements without appearing to prioritize convenience over data protection. The meeting ended with a directive to review all IT access controls and develop procedures for emergency situations. Michael was clearly frustrated, but he couldn't argue against the principle of improved security, especially after the company had spent considerable time talking about protecting client data and maintaining compliance. Over the following days, Cassandra continued her systematic reduction of system access. Each permission she removed made the company slightly more dependent on external support or formal procedures for tasks that had previously been handled immediately. The email server was her next target. Dataflow's email system had been experiencing intermittent performance issues for weeks, the kind of gradual degradation that required periodic maintenance and optimization. Previously, Cassandra would have addressed these issues during routine maintenance windows or as part of her weekend work. Now, with her email server administrative access removed, these minor issues began accumulating into more noticeable problems. Email delivery became slower, server storage began filling up with unarchived messages, and the automated reporting. Systems that sent daily summaries to clients started experiencing delays. Marcus tried to address the email performance issues, but his limited access only allowed him to perform basic user management tasks. He couldn't optimize server configurations, clean up storage, or modify the automated reporting systems that were beginning to malfunction. The email problems created a cascade of smaller issues throughout the company. Clients began complaining about delayed reports. Internal communications became less reliable. The automated backup notification system stopped working properly, meaning that future backup failures might not be detected immediately. Each individual problem was minor, but collectively they began to create an impression that Dataflow's technical infrastructure was becoming less reliable. The company that had built its reputation on smooth operations and quick response times was starting to experience the kinds of technical glitches and delays that frustrated both employees and clients. Meanwhile, Cassandra maintained her professional demeanor and continued performing the work that remained within her access levels. When colleagues asked about various technical issues, she explained that the problems were outside her current system permissions and would need to be handled through proper support channels. The irony was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone except management. Dataflow had decided that Cassandra's expertise wasn't worth overtime compensation, but they were now paying premium rates for external support to handle issues she could have resolved quickly. They were experiencing delays and inefficiencies that directly contradicted their promises to clients about reliable service and rapid response times. But the most significant test was still approaching. Cassandra knew that her methodical removal of system access was building toward a larger crisis, one that would demonstrate just how dependent Dataflow's operations had become on her weekend interventions and emergency expertise. The weekend before everything collapses started like any other. For the first time in months, Cassandra had no urgent work requests, no emergency implementations, and no weekend overtime expectations. Dataflow's management had effectively gotten what they'd asked for: a systems administrator who worked only during regular business hours. Saturday morning, Cassandra was enjoying coffee in her kitchen when her phone buzzed with automated system alerts. The monitoring systems she'd configured were still sending notifications to her personal device, even though she no longer had the access to respond to most of them. The first alert was routine. A scheduled maintenance window for one of their smaller clients had completed successfully. But the second alert made her pause. The primary database server was showing elevated memory usage and slower response times. It wasn't critical yet, but it was the kind of gradual performance degradation that typically preceded more serious problems. Under normal circumstances, Cassandra would have logged in remotely to investigate the memory usage patterns and optimize the database configuration. The fix usually involved clearing temporary cache files, restarting specific services, and adjusting memory allocation settings, routine maintenance that took about 30 minutes. Instead, she set her phone aside and went back to her coffee. The performance issue would either resolve itself or escalate to something that required formal support channels. Either way, it was no longer her weekend problem to solve. Sunday afternoon brought a flurry of additional alerts. The database performance had continued degrading, and now multiple client portals were experiencing slower response times. The email server was struggling with a backlog of automated reports that couldn't be processed efficiently due to the database slowdown. The backup system had started, but was running significantly behind schedule because it couldn't extract data quickly enough from the sluggish database. Marcus received the same alerts on his phone, but his weekend consisted of increasingly frustrated attempts to address issues he couldn't actually fix. He could see the problems clearly through the monitoring dashboards, but his limited access meant he could only restart basic services and clear simple log files. He called Cassandra Sunday evening, sounding stressed and overwhelmed. "The database server is really struggling," he said. "Response times are terrible, and I think it's affecting everything else. I've tried restarting the application services, but the core database performance is still awful." "What does memory usage look like?" Cassandra asked, though she already knew the answer from her own monitoring alerts. "It's running at about 95% capacity. I can see that temporary cache files are consuming massive amounts of memory, but I don't have access to clear them safely. The database administration tools require permissions I don't have." "Have you contacted vendor support?" "I tried, but it's Sunday evening. The earliest I can get someone is Monday morning, and even then they'll need time to analyze the system before they can make changes." Cassandra felt a familiar tug of professional responsibility. Part of her wanted to walk Marcus through the fix or offer to handle it herself. but she reminded herself of Dataflow's recent message about the value of her expertise. If weekend work wasn't worth overtime compensation, then weekend problems weren't worth her immediate attention. Document everything carefully, she advised Marcus. Make sure you have detailed logs and performance metrics to share with vendor support tomorrow. That'll help them diagnose the issues more quickly. Sunday night, the alerts became more frequent and more serious. The database performance had degraded to the point where client portals were timing out completely. The email server had stopped processing automated reports entirely. The backup system had failed after running for 12 hours without successfully completing its data extraction. But the most concerning development was happening in the background, invisible to most monitoring systems. The database's memory management problems were causing cascading errors in the application code. Temporary files were accumulating faster than they could be processed, and the server's storage systems were approaching capacity limits. Years earlier, Cassandra had implemented automated cleanup processes that would normally prevent these kinds of accumulating problems. But those cleanup processes required administrative access to run properly, and she'd systematically removed her access to the scheduling and management systems that controlled them. The server was essentially choking on its own temporary data, like a sink with a clogged drain that was slowly filling with water. Without intervention, the situation would eventually reach a tipping point where the entire system would become unresponsive. Monday morning arrived with Dataflow's infrastructure in a precarious state. The database server was barely functional, multiple client systems were offline, and the email system had completely stopped working. But the worst was yet to come. .ue, 8:47 a.m. Just as employees were settling in for the work week, the primary database server reached its storage capacity limit. With nowhere to write new data or create temporary processing files, the database engine crashed completely. The crash had immediate and catastrophic effects throughout Dataflow's entire infrastructure. Client portals that were already struggling with slow performance suddenly displayed error messages instead of login screens. The email system, which relied on the database for user authentication and message routing, became completely inoperable. Internal applications that employees used for everything from timekeeping to project management stopped working entirely. Within minutes, Dataflow's phone system was overwhelmed with calls from confused clients who couldn't access their data. The company's 43 employees found themselves unable to perform basic work functions because their computer systems had become largely useless. Michael Rodriguez arrived at the office to find complete chaos. Employees were clustered around desks, trying to figure out why nothing was working. The customer service team was fielding angry calls from clients who needed access to their data for Monday morning operations. The sales team couldn't access their customer relationship management system to prepare for scheduled presentations. "What the hell is happening?" Michael demanded as he burst into the IT area where Marcus was frantically trying to restart various services. "The primary database server crashed about an hour ago," Marcus explained, sweat visible on his forehead despite the cool office temperature. "Everything that depends on the database is down, which is pretty much our entire infrastructure." "Well, fix it." "I'm trying, but I don't have administrative access to the database server. I can see that it crashed due to storage capacity issues, but I can't clear the temporary files or restart the database engine safely. I need help from vendor support or someone with higher-level access." Michael's face turned red. "Where's Cassandra? She can fix this." Marcus glanced toward Cassandra's desk, where she was calmly reviewing system status reports on her computer. "She doesn't have database administrative access anymore. She removed those permissions a few weeks ago as part of security compliance." Michael stormed over to Cassandra's workstation. She looked up from her computer with a professional expression, as if the crisis unfolding around her was merely an interesting technical puzzle rather than a company-threatening emergency. "I need you to fix the database server," Michael said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Everything is down, and we have clients screaming about lost access to their data." "I understand the urgency," Cassandra replied calmly, "but I don't." currently have the administrative access required to address database server crashes. Those permissions were removed as part of our security optimization initiative. Then get the access back. Restoring administrative access requires formal approval through our security protocols. I'll need to submit a request with business justification and wait for approval from the appropriate authorities. Michael stared at her in disbelief. How long does that take? The standard approval process is 24 to 48 hours, depending on the complexity of the access request and the availability of approving authorities. We can't wait 2 days. We have clients threatening to cancel contracts. I understand your concern, Cassandra said, maintaining her professional tone. The alternative is to engage emergency vendor support for database recovery services. They should be able to restore functionality, though it may take several hours, and will likely be expensive. Behind Michael, the chaos was intensifying. Sandra Phillips was on the phone with Great Lakes Manufacturing, trying to explain why their portal was completely offline less than 2 weeks after the previous connectivity problems. Other employees were discovering that they couldn't access email, file servers, or any of the applications they needed to do their jobs. The irony of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Dataflow had decided that Cassandra's weekend expertise wasn't worth overtime compensation, but now they desperately needed that same expertise to prevent the complete collapse of their business operations. And for the first time in years, Cassandra was in a position to watch the crisis unfold without feeling obligated to sacrifice her personal time to fix problems that management had decided weren't worth paying her fairly to prevent. By 10:30 a.m., Dataflow's office had transformed into a war room. Michael Rodriguez had assembled the entire executive team in the main conference room, while employees throughout the building sat at useless computers, unable to perform even basic tasks. The phones rang constantly with increasingly irate clients, demanding explanations for why their critical business systems were offline. The emergency database vendor support call had become a comedy of errors. The first technician couldn't access Dataflow's systems remotely because the authentication servers were down. The second technician needed to understand the specific database configuration, but the documentation was stored on the file servers that were also offline. The third technician required administrative credentials that only Cassandra had historically used, but which were now deactivated. "This is insane," Sandra Phillips announced to the room, slamming her phone down after another hostile conversation with a client. "Midwest Medical Associates is talking about switching to our competitor. They can't access patient scheduling data, and their afternoon appointments are in jeopardy. Great Lakes Manufacturing has given us until noon to restore their portal, or they're activating their backup data provider," added James Chen, the operations director. "That's a $2 million contract walking out the door." Brenda Harrison looked pale as she realized the financial implications of the crisis. "How much revenue are we losing every hour this continues?" "Based on our client contracts and penalty clauses, approximately $47,000 per hour," Michael replied grimly. "And that doesn't include the long-term damage to our reputation or the cost of emergency technical support." All eyes turned to Cassandra, who remained the only person in the building with the theoretical knowledge to resolve the crisis quickly. But she also remained the only person who definitively couldn't access the systems needed to implement solutions. "I need to understand something," Michael said, addressing Cassandra directly. "You removed your own administrative access to prevent yourself from fixing exactly this kind of problem." "I implemented security best practices to limit administrative access to only what's necessary for routine responsibilities," Cassandra corrected. "The goal was to reduce security risks and improve compliance with industry standards." "But you knew this would make emergency responses impossible?" "I knew it. Would require following proper procedures for emergency access?" "Yes. That's considered a feature of good security architecture, not a bug." Brenda Harrison shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She was beginning to understand the connection between her recent decisions about Cassandra's overtime compensation and the current crisis. But she couldn't acknowledge it without admitting that the company's compensation policies had directly contributed to their technical vulnerabilities. "What would it take to restore your access immediately?" Michael asked. "Emergency access restoration requires approval from our security officer, IT director, and executive leadership," Cassandra explained. "It also requires documented business, justification, and acknowledgement of security risks. I'm the CEO. Can I just authorize it? You could authorize a security policy exception, but implementing the technical changes would still require someone with current administrative access to our identity management systems. That person would need to validate the request and make the actual permission changes. And who has that access? Currently, no one on our staff has the level of access needed to restore high-level administrative permissions. Those functions were centralized under my previous access profile." The room fell silent as the full scope of the problem became clear. Cassandra had systematically removed not just her own access to various systems, but had also eliminated the company's ability to quickly restore that access when needed. "So you're telling me," Michael said slowly, "that you're the only person who can fix our systems, but you've made it impossible for yourself to access our systems?" "That's essentially correct, yes." "How is that not sabotage?" Cassandra remained calm under Michael's accusatory stare. "Limiting administrative access is a standard security practice recommended by every major cybersecurity framework. I followed established protocols for access reduction and documented every change I made. The goal was to improve our security, posture, and reduce risks associated with excessive administrative privileges. But you knew it would create this situation. I knew it would require following proper emergency procedures instead of relying on ad hoc solutions. That's what security frameworks are designed to accomplish." The emergency vendor support finally made progress around 11:15 a.m., but not in the way anyone had hoped. The lead technician informed Michael that they could restore basic database functionality, but it would require rebuilding the server configuration from scratch using backup data. The process would take a minimum of 8 hours and cost approximately $15,000 in emergency support fees. 8 hours? Sandra Phillips exploded. "We'll lose every major client we have." "There might be a faster option," the technician explained over speakerphone. "If someone on your staff has intimate knowledge of your current database configuration and can guide us through the restoration process, we could potentially reduce the time to 2 or 3 hours." Everyone looked at Cassandra again. She was the only person who had the detailed knowledge of Dataflow's database architecture, optimization settings, and custom configurations that could accelerate the recovery process. "I'd be happy to provide technical guidance," Cassandra said, "but I would need temporary administrative access to view current system states and validate configuration settings during the restoration process." "Fine," Michael shouted. "Whatever it takes. Just get our systems back online." "I'll need formal authorization for emergency access restoration," Cassandra continued professionally. "And given the scope of the crisis and the weekend work that will likely be required to fully stabilize our systems, I'll need confirmation of appropriate compensation for overtime hours." The conference room became deadly quiet. Brenda Harrison's face turned red as she realized that Cassandra was directly connecting the current crisis to the company's recent decision about weekend overtime compensation. "Are you seriously trying to negotiate salary terms while our entire company is crashing?" Michael demanded. "I'm ensuring that proper procedures are followed for both emergency access and compensation policies," Cassandra replied calmly. "The same attention to procedures and policies that led to our current security protocols." Brenda Harrison spoke up, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "This is extortion. You've deliberately created this crisis to force the company into paying overtime rates you're not entitled to." Cassandra turned to face Brenda directly. "I've implemented security best practices that you supported when they were described as efficiency improvements and cost reduction measures. The current crisis results from our infrastructure depending on procedures and access levels that were deemed unnecessary when compensation discussions arose. That's completely different, is it?" 3 weeks ago, This company decided that my weekend expertise wasn't worth overtime compensation. Today, you're discovering the cost of not having access to that expertise. I'm simply maintaining consistency with the company's stated values about the worth of my technical contributions. The truth hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everyone in the room understood what had happened, even if they couldn't admit it openly. Dataflow had decided that Cassandra's skills weren't worth fair compensation, and she had systematically demonstrated how much the company actually depended on those skills. Michael looked around the room at his executive team, all of whom were avoiding eye contact. The choice was brutal but clear. Acknowledge that they'd been wrong about Cassandra's value and restore her compensation, or watch their company collapse in real time. "What exactly are you asking for?" he said finally. "Restoration of appropriate overtime compensation for weekend work, retroactive to the denied payment from 3 weeks ago. Going forward, weekend technical work will be compensated at overtime rates as originally agreed upon. And I'll need a formal apology from HR for the suggestion that my expertise was unnecessary and inefficient." Brenda Harrison looked like she wanted to object, but Michael cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Done," he said. "Whatever you want. Just fix our systems." "I'll need that in writing," Cassandra replied, "with signatures from executive leadership and HR. Once I have formal confirmation of the policy changes, I'll be happy to begin the emergency access restoration process." As Brenda reluctantly began drafting the compensation agreement, Cassandra finally allowed herself a small smile. She'd spent 3 weeks methodically demonstrating her actual value to Dataflow Solutions, and the lesson had cost them far more than the overtime payment they'd tried to deny her. But more importantly, she'd proven that treating skilled employees as expendable resources was a luxury that companies like Dataflow couldn't actually afford. The emergency access restoration took 47 minutes, but not for technical reasons. While Cassandra waited for the signed compensation agreement, Dataflow continued hemorrhaging money and clients with each passing hour. The emergency vendor support team sat on hold, billing premium rates while executives frantically negotiated terms they should have honored weeks earlier. Brenda Harrison's hands shook slightly as she printed the formal agreement, acknowledging Cassandra's retroactive overtime compensation and future weekend pay structure. Michael Rodriguez signed it without reading the details, his attention focused on the growing list of client cancellation threats accumulating on his desk. At 12:18 p.m., Cassandra finally logged into the emergency access restoration system and began working with the vendor support team to rebuild Dataflow's crashed infrastructure. What followed was a masterclass in technical expertise that reminded everyone why she'd been irreplaceable all along. Within the first 10 minutes, Cassandra had identified 3 critical configuration errors that the vendor team had missed during their initial assessment. Her intimate knowledge of Dataflow's custom database optimizations and security protocols allowed her to guide the restoration process with surgical precision. The memory allocation parameters need to be set to these specific values, she explained to the lead technician over speakerphone while simultaneously monitoring system recovery metrics. "Your standard configuration won't work with our custom indexing structure." As the primary database came back online, Cassandra immediately began addressing the cascade of secondary problems that had accumulated over the weekend. She cleared the massive backlog of temporary files, restarted the automated cleanup processes that had been failing, and reconfigured the email server to handle the thousands of queued messages waiting for delivery. But she didn't just fix the immediate crisis. With surgical precision, she began restoring her administrative access to other systems throughout Dataflow's infrastructure, methodically reversing the permission restrictions she'd implemented over the previous weeks. Each system that came back under her control operated more smoothly than it had in weeks. The network routing issues that had plagued Great Lakes Manufacturing disappeared when she optimized the firewall configurations. The email performance problems vanished when she implemented the server maintenance that had been deferred due to access restrictions. By 2:30 p.m., Dataflow's infrastructure was not only fully operational, but running better than it had in months. Client portals loaded faster, automated reports processed without delays, and the backup systems completed their cycles efficiently for the first time in weeks. Marcus watched in amazement as Cassandra systematically restored order to systems that had been gradually degrading for weeks. "I didn't realize how many small issues had been accumulating," he admitted. "Everything seems to be running so much smoother now." "Preventive maintenance is like exercise," Cassandra replied while monitoring system performance metrics. "Skip it for a few weeks and you don't notice much difference. Skip it for a few months and suddenly you can't run up a flight of stairs." The immediate crisis was over, but the aftermath revealed the true scope of what had happened. Sandra. Philip spent the afternoon on damage control calls with major clients, explaining the outage and offering service credits to prevent contract cancellations. The financial cost extended far beyond the emergency vendor support fees. Great Lakes Manufacturing demanded a 20% service credit for the month, costing Dataflow approximately $40,000. Midwest Medical Associates required additional security assurances and backup system guarantees that would cost another $15,000 to implement. 3 smaller clients had already signed contracts with competitors during the outage. The total financial impact of the Monday morning crash approached $200,000 when all costs and lost revenue were calculated. The retroactive overtime payment that Brenda Harrison had fought so hard to deny amounted to $1,200. But the personal reckonings were just beginning. Michael Rodriguez called individual meetings with each executive team member to discuss how a simple overtime dispute had nearly destroyed the company. His conversation with Brenda Harrison was particularly tense. "Help me understand how denying $1,200 in overtime pay led to a crisis that cost us $200,000, he said, closing his office door for privacy. Cassandra deliberately manipulated the situation, Brenda replied, defensively. She removed her own system access to create leverage for salary negotiations. That's textbook workplace manipulation. According to the documentation she provided, she implemented security best practices that we'd been discussing for months. Every change she made followed established protocols and was properly justified. But she knew it would create problems. Did she? Or did we create problems by deciding that her expertise wasn't worth paying for properly? Michael's question hung in the air uncomfortably. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like we got exactly what we asked for. We wanted efficient operations that didn't depend on expensive weekend overtime. We got operations so efficient that they couldn't respond to emergencies. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, but the conclusion was inevitable. Brenda Harrison's approach to optimizing human resources expenditure had backfired spectacularly, demonstrating that some employees' contributions were worth far more than their salary suggested. Meanwhile, Cassandra was documenting the system, restoration process, and preparing detailed reports on the infrastructure improvements she'd implemented during the recovery. She worked methodically through the afternoon, ensuring that Dataflow's systems were not just restored, but more robust than before. Around 4 p.m., she received an unexpected visit from Marcus, who appeared at her desk with a coffee and a sheepish expression. "I owe you an apology," he said, setting the coffee down next to her keyboard. "I spent this whole weekend trying to handle system issues I wasn't qualified for, getting increasingly frustrated that I couldn't fix problems that seemed like they should be simple." "System administration is deceptively complex," Cassandra replied, accepting the peace offering. "The things that look simple usually require years of experience to handle properly. I realize now that I was inadvertently benefiting from all the weekend work you were doing. When systems ran smoothly, I assumed it was because the infrastructure was well designed. I didn't understand how much active maintenance and intervention was happening behind the scenes. That's not uncommon. Good system administration is invisible when it's working properly. People only notice the infrastructure when it breaks." Marcus hesitated before continuing. I also understand now why you were frustrated about the overtime compensation. I thought weekend work was just part of the job, but I didn't realize how much of your personal time was being consumed to keep everything running smoothly. Their conversation was interrupted by Michael Rodriguez, who approached Cassandra's desk with an expression that mixed relief, embarrassment, and grudging respect. "I wanted to thank you personally for getting us through today," he said. "And I owe you an apology for not understanding the value of the work you've been doing." "I appreciate that," Cassandra replied diplomatically. "I also wanted to discuss your role going forward. Today made it clear that we've been underutilizing your expertise and undervaluing your contributions. I'd like to talk about a promotion to IT Director, with appropriate compensation and recognition of your essential role in our operations." Cassandra leaned back in her chair, considering the offer. The promotion would mean better pay, more authority, and formal recognition of her expertise. But it would also mean more responsibility for managing the very executives who had dismissed her value just hours earlier. "I'm interested in discussing the position," she said carefully. "But I'd want to ensure that any new role comes with appropriate decision-making authority over technical infrastructure and emergency response procedures." Absolutely. Today proved that technical decisions should be made by technical experts, not by people trying to optimize spreadsheets. As the workday ended, Cassandra reflected on the events of the past month. Her systematic demonstration of indispensability had succeeded beyond her expectations, but it had also revealed something important about workplace dynamics and the value of specialized expertise. Companies like Dataflow often took their most essential employees for granted, assuming that critical work would continue regardless of how it was compensated or recognized. They optimized for short-term cost savings without understanding the long-term risks of undervaluing the people who kept their operations functioning. Her revenge hadn't been about destroying the company or causing permanent damage. It had been about education, forcing management to confront the actual cost of their decisions and the real value of expertise they'd been dismissing as routine overhead. As she gathered her things to leave the office, Cassandra smiled at the irony. Dataflow had tried to reduce their dependence on her weekend work by denying fair compensation for it. Instead, they'd learned that their dependence was far deeper than they'd realized, and that the cost of acknowledging it was far less than the cost of ignoring it. 6 months later, Cassandra Mitchell sat in her new corner office, reviewing quarterly infrastructure reports as Dataflow's newly appointed IT director. The view from her window overlooked the parking lot where she'd once sat in her car, watching chaos unfold through the glass doors. Now, that same building housed one of the most stable and efficient technical operations in the region. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the weeks following the Monday morning crash, Cassandra had systematically rebuilt not just Dataflow's infrastructure, but the entire company's approach to technology management and employee evaluation. Her first major initiative as IT director had been implementing proper change management procedures. No longer could executives make arbitrary decisions about technical policies without understanding their implications. Every proposed change to IT operations now required technical impact assessments and formal approval from the IT department. She'd also established clear escalation procedures for emergency situations, with defined roles and responsibilities that prevented the kind of access bottlenecks that had caused the original crisis. Marcus Thompson had been promoted to Senior Systems Administrator and was thriving under Cassandra's mentorship, developing the expertise needed to handle complex technical challenges. But perhaps most importantly, she'd instituted transparent documentation of all weekend and after-hours work, with mandatory compensation at appropriate overtime rates. The new policies weren't just about fair pay. They were about ensuring that the company understood the true cost of maintaining their technical infrastructure. The results spoke for themselves. Dataflow hadn't experienced a single major outage since Cassandra's promotion. Client satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. The company had successfully retained all their major contracts, and had even won back 2 of the clients who'd left during the Monday morning crisis. Michael Rodriguez had become one of Cassandra's strongest supporters, publicly crediting her leadership with the company's improved technical stability. During board meetings, he regularly emphasized how investing in proper IT leadership and compensation had delivered measurable returns in client retention and operational efficiency. Cassandra's approach to infrastructure management has fundamentally changed how we operate, he'd told the board during their most recent quarterly review. We've gone from crisis management to predictive maintenance, from reactive fixes to proactive optimization. The cost savings from preventing outages alone have paid for her department's budget increases several times over. The relationship with Brenda Harrison had required more delicate navigation. The HR director had initially resisted the new IT policies, viewing them as challenges to her authority over employee compensation and work schedules. But a series of frank conversations with Michael had helped her understand that technical expertise required different management approaches than traditional office roles. Brenda had eventually become an ally, working with Cassandra to develop fair compensation structures for technical roles and proper procedures for evaluating specialized employee contributions. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about the difference between cost optimization and value optimization. I learned that not all expenses are the same, Brenda admitted during one of their quarterly HRIT coordination meetings. Cutting costs in the wrong places can end up being far more expensive than investing appropriately from the beginning. The most gratifying change had been in company culture. Dataflow's executives now regularly acknowledge the technical team's contributions during client meetings and company announcements. Weekend work was treated as valuable expertise rather than routine expectation, and emergency responses were compensated and recognized appropriately. Cassandra had also implemented professional development programs for the IT team, ensuring that Marcus and other technical staff could advance their skills and careers without having to prove their worth through workplace crises. The company now invested in training, certifications, and conference attendance as part of their commitment to technical excellence. The success had attracted attention from other companies in the region. Cassandra regularly received recruiting calls from organizations looking to improve their own IT operations. But she'd found satisfaction in transforming Dataflow from the inside, proving that companies could change their approach to employee evaluation when the consequences of poor decisions became clear enough. During a recent industry conference, she'd presented a case study on infrastructure resilience through employee investment, sharing lessons from Dataflow's transformation, without revealing the specific details of how that transformation had begun. The presentation had been well received, with several attendees asking for follow-up consultations about implementing similar approaches in their own organizations. One afternoon, while reviewing system performance metrics that showed 6 months of perfect uptime, Cassandra reflected on the path that had brought her to this position. The systematic removal of her own system access had been risky, requiring careful planning and perfect timing to avoid causing permanent damage to the company. But it had also been necessary. Traditional approaches to workplace negotiation, meetings, discussions, formal requests, had failed to convey the actual value of her contributions. Sometimes, the only way to demonstrate essential expertise was to temporarily withdraw it and let the consequences speak for themselves. The lesson extended beyond her specific situation. Throughout the technology industry, skilled professionals were often taken for granted by management teams who didn't understand the complexity of keeping digital infrastructure running smoothly. The invisible nature of good system administration meant that successful technical work often went unrecognized until something went wrong. Her approach had been to make that invisible work visible by temporarily removing it from the equation. The resulting crisis had forced everyone at Dataflow to confront the difference between having reliable technical expertise and not having it. Marcus knocked on her office door, interrupting her thoughts. The Great Lakes Manufacturing Quarterly. "Review is ready," he said, holding a tablet with performance metrics. Their portal has maintained 99.97% uptime this quarter, and response times are averaging 30% faster than their contract requirements. Excellent work, Cassandra replied, reviewing the data. That's the kind of performance that builds long-term client relationships. It's amazing how much smoother everything runs when we can do proper preventive maintenance instead of constantly fighting fires, Marcus observed. I understand now why you were so frustrated when weekend work wasn't being compensated fairly. It wasn't just about the money. It was about recognizing that preventing problems is more valuable than fixing them after they happen. Later that evening, as Cassandra prepared to leave the office at a reasonable hour for the first time in years, she received an email from Janet Walsh at Great Lakes Manufacturing. The operations manager who had once screamed at Marcus during the Monday morning crisis was now writing to express appreciation for Dataflow's consistently excellent service. Your team's proactive approach to system management has been exceptional, Janet wrote. We've had zero unexpected downtime this quarter, and your advance notifications about planned maintenance windows allow us to schedule our operations efficiently. This is exactly the kind of reliable partnership we value. Cassandra forwarded the email to Michael and the executive team, another small reminder of how investing in proper IT management delivered measurable business results. As she walked to her car in the same parking lot where she'd once watched her former workplace implode, Cassandra felt a deep sense of professional satisfaction. She'd not only achieved fair compensation and recognition for her expertise, but had transformed an entire company's approach to valuing technical contributions. The revenge had evolved into something far more meaningful than simple workplace justice. It had become a demonstration that skilled employees didn't have to accept being undervalued, and that companies benefited significantly when they learned to properly invest in the expertise that kept their operations running. Dataflow Solutions was now a model for how technology companies could succeed by recognizing and rewarding the specialized knowledge that made their business possible. And Cassandra Mitchell had proven that sometimes the most effective way to teach people your value was to show them what life looked like without it. The lesson had cost Dataflow approximately $200,000 to learn, but the education had been worth every penny, transforming a company that took expertise for granted into one that understood the true cost and value of technical excellence. As she drove home that evening, Cassandra smiled at the thought that she would never again have to choose between fair compensation and doing work she was passionate about. She'd found a way to have both, while teaching an entire organization that investing in people was always more profitable than exploiting them. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.